Okay, I'll start. Um, when I was added to the mailing list for the discussion of this topic on open source languages, I'm sorry, I've forgotten your name. I bet you it was you. Said, I bet you this is about Python versus PHP. And my response was, no, there are all sorts of other languages to talk about. Because despite the fact that the web is the biggest proportion of open source development, it's actually kind of boring. So I'd like to make sure that we cover some of the new languages, the languages with different structure and for different purposes. On the mailing list, I mentioned processing and Erlang, so I'm hoping that that comes up. But I think we should just go through all the panelists and we'll introduce ourselves and talk about what languages maybe we specialize in and what perspective we're coming from, because I think we all come from a different perspective. So I'll start with myself. My name's Tom Rathborn, and for the past 15 years or so, I've been working on web application frameworks, but everything from putting together the hardware to putting together the operating system, configuring that, adding all the server applications, configuring that, and making the front end of the web application itself, right down to Ajax UIs. But that was in Toronto for the past 15 years, and I've just shifted to Bangalore to work for Yahoo, and in small business operations. So my focus has gone from the entire stack to just keeping it running, troubleshooting, firefighting, that sort of thing. That's my perspective, and I'm wearing a shirt here that says PHP considered harmful, because I come from a computer science background, and the ease of use and ease of adoption of PHP, from my perspective, is a trap, because I've seen so many people who come to programming in PHP where there are certain language constructs that Perl, Python, Ruby, Java all have that PHP lacks. And sure, that means that you can write an application quickly, and it also means that you don't need any discipline, and you don't really need to understand what you're doing. So there are pros and cons to that. And considered harmful is a well-known phrase in the industry. I think BASIC and CSH are previous examples that have been given this label, and for similar reasons. It's that when things are too easy, it means that you don't learn how to program correctly, and it makes you lazy and sloppy. And from the operations perspective and from a development perspective, whenever I've looked at a piece of PHP, that's what I found, where the bug is some basic error that would have been caught by the compiler of any other language. So that's my perspective. Do we have a microphone? Yeah, pick it up.
So I think this is going to be a healthy debate. So I'm certainly from the other side of the camp. I certainly think PHP is a fantastic language, and I'll probably be talking about that. I think there'll be a rich debate for that reason. My background is I've been now 12 years in the software engineering industry. I work for working for software services MNCs. I think there are a lot of in India. I got into the open source domain about 7 years ago. I started with the Apache projects. I started contributing to those, and I'm committed on Apache. And after the tsunami that devastated my country, which is Sri Lanka, we all volunteered to build a disaster management system, an open source disaster management system called Sahana. And that system became a global open source project, and we applied it in a lot of countries, including India, Pakistan right now. And it was a very valuable experience. on the application of programming languages, because we actually use multiple languages in the response effort. And in that context, the requirements are very different to the enterprise context. So I can talk a little bit about that. So I have a range of experience. I have created stuff, mainly in application development, in Java, in C#, in C, in Perl, Python, JavaScript. So I do have an exposure to the formal languages, so to speak. So I can talk to that as well.
Hi, I'm Kevin Schrader. I'm Technology Evangelist for Zen Technologies. I'm actually going to go the exact opposite way, and I think that being a lazy programmer is actually a good thing. I've actually found that when I was working at Zen, previous to being a technology evangelist, I was working in the consulting department. And one of the things I would do was go around and I'd do performance audits on various customer applications. And in a large majority of the circumstances where there were significant performance issues in applications, I actually found that it was because of developers who were trying to be too smart. They're trying to do things that the engine wasn't necessarily designed to do. And so what they would end up doing is they'd hear about some new design pattern that was, taking the world by storm, and so then they'd go and try and implement it in PHP the exact same way they implemented it in every other language. And PHP, like Perl, like Ruby, like Java, like .NET, like whatever else, every individual language has its own way of doing things. And some of the things I've seen in PHP usually come from when there's issues that come out. It often comes about when people either A, try to let the engine do too much for them, like let all the things like the type juggling and things like that to kind of do some of the black magic for them. And other times you have the people who want to take what kind of the Java level of application architecture and throw it onto PHP when PHP itself doesn't actually work very well in that way. And so from a programming perspective, learning to know the engine that you have and learning to use it well has been one of the things that's really helped me to kind of become a better PHP programmer. For myself, there's really only two languages that I personally work with, and it depends on what it is that I'm actually doing. If I'm working on the web, then PHP for me is just a logical choice. It works well with the web. It was designed for the web. It's very easy to build applications. And if there's something else that I don't need that's necessarily a web-based type of an application, then I'll generally just use Java for no other reason than Java is what I know. I'd like to do it in C, like to do it in C++, but Java is what I know. And so one of the things I think that people often make the mistake of, they look at a situation, an individual situation, and they try to figure out, okay, what's the best programming language that I can use for this individual situation? And I think that's actually the wrong approach to take. I think what people need to do more often is to look at what it is that they know well, and look at the situation that they need to work within, and see how is it, can they take the skill set that they currently know and make it work for that situation. We have I don't know if there's a saying here, if you're familiar with it in India, but in the US that we have the saying the jack of all
XML, RPC all became buzzwords. I was like, duh, I've been doing that for years. What's the big deal? I personally have, I've sort of gotten tired of the CGI interface. CGI was invented to run scripts on the web in, 1992? 1993, something like that? And so all CGI is that your CGI program gets as input whatever the user's web browser has sent, say as a post, and then a whole bunch of stuff in environment variables, including the query string and all sorts of stuff like that. And it's the job of your CGI program to, on standard output, spit out an HTML document or whatever, an HTTP response. We still see that in PHP, right? Many PHP applications pretty much use the environment and things like that. It's been wrapped a little bit to be a little cleaner now, but when you're writing a PHP page, it could run under CGI, it could run as an Apache module, it could run as an IIS module, but you're still essentially using that CGI interface. So I think that's a little bit stale. And I don't know, I'd like to talk about how we can build multi-language web systems and maybe replace CGI with something that's a little more elegant. Anyone have any ideas on that?
Well, I mean, part of the question is, really what is it that makes a lot of these individual languages popular? What makes an individual environment popular? And what I think that we've often found in the computer world, actually pretty much in almost any place, it's usually not the ideal solution that ends up getting adopted. It's the one that has the right combination of ease of use, implementation, functionality, features, and things like that. HTTP is a horrible protocol,
Agreed.
except for everything else that's been tried.
Right.
To paraphrase, who am I paraphrasing now?
I've lost track, actually. It's like X11. It's the
Yeah.
very worst windowing system except for all the others.
Right.
That's where I heard it first.
Right, and well, it's actually somebody said it about democracy. Democracy is the worst system devised, except for all the others that have been tried. And HTTP is the worst protocol that's been devised, except for all the other ones that have been tried. And so the reason why I think that HTTP was successful is it was easy to locate information. You could link back and forth between information using hypertext and things like that. And so while it may not necessarily be ideal, it's easy to use, everybody can use it, it's easy to implement, and it just kind of works, which is I think also one of the reasons why PHP has the popularity that it does. PHP is by no stretch a perfect language, and any PHP developer would admit as much. But what PHP does is you have a task, it gets it done. It may not be perfect, but it gets that task done. And so the whole way that we're transferring information across the web and communicating with people in different countries, using HTTP, using SOAP, using and then defining that within the WSDL or using XMRPC, JSON RPC, whatever it is, they're all imperfect, but they're easy to use. Well, SOAP's not easy to use. But you have this interoperability between the individual languages and between these individual communities that almost generates, almost self-generates and self-propagates, not because it's based off of perfection or standards, but because it's just something that it's democratized. You take a look at a popular programming languages, and specifically PHP. And the reason why it's popular is just because it's a democratized language. You can take it and anybody can build on it. It's definitely not something you're going to see a computer science project on, but that's not what it's for. It's there so you can build fast web applications very quickly. And so we live in a world of the imperfect. And it's usually the imperfect, but the useful and the usable are the ones that have a tendency to win out.
All right, I'm admittedly an uncompromising idealist in that regard. Practicality isn't my concern.
I tend to agree with that because I think that the language might be imperfect. I think the popularity and focus of the language makes a tremendous impact because it's the supporting community and the momentum around it can, sometimes work towards evolving and ironing out the issues that you find in progressive versions of that language. I certainly think PHP will progress. It will gradually fix those problems. As you highlight them, the community will work to iron out those issues gradually. So I think this is something that's unique also to the open source world. I mean, that's the nice thing about open source programming languages versus languages that are defined by a particular company or organization. In the open source community, it's a very democratized society. And you have that diversity of views, but there's also focus. For example, there is a healthy debate now, at least in my community, in the Sahana community, we are using both Python and PHP. We have two implementations, maybe slightly different focuses. And we did that because actually we were catering to the needs of the people who were contributing. They maybe come in, they like to work in a particular language. And so we organized projects that allows them to contribute that value in that language of choice. But the popularity of a particular language does make a tremendous impact in terms of how people organize themselves and contribute to it. So I think that matters a lot. And focus, particularly, of course, I'm supposed to be neutral in this community, but for me, Python can be used for a lot of things. It's a bit more of a jack of all trades, right? So you can use it for desktop development, and you can use it for many different things. But PHP has a very specific focus, and that's web development, and it's tailored for that. It has a dialect that is optimized for that. So if I was to do development, I would choose PHP.
Kevin and I were having a discussion this morning about, I asked him a question about, doing some little PHP projects, and I wanted to, I had situations where I really needed multitasking. And PHP isn't the best multitasker. There's certain things you can do, like if you're doing data transfers, you can use, mosquitoes everywhere. If you're doing data transfers, you can use multi-curl, and it has you can do process forks, right? If you're running on Unix, and there's I don't know. There's probably you can exec things. That's another way out to do kind of faux multitasking. But it's not a really good multitasking language. So I was saying, what's an approach? And Kevin had suggested a couple. One is a product of theirs, the Zen Server. What's it called?
Zen Server Job Queue.
Yeah, Zen Server Job Queue,
Which is awesome.
which Kevin says is awesome. But there's also there's an open source project called Gearman, and so I was looking at Gearman because my needs were in this case were sort of for demo purposes. So something that just an open source product would be fine probably. But what's interesting is that Gearman is a daemon basically, and so Gearman you have two choices for the daemon. It's either Java or C. So you can think about this. Well, okay, those are kind of the natural. If you're running on Linux or Unix, and you're writing a daemon, you're probably going to write it in C or Java, right? You're probably not going to write it in PHP or Python or scripting. You could, but that's probably not what you're going to choose because you want a compiled language because it's going to be more, faster and more compact, and the C and Java have good memory management, garbage collection. More control over the application. So the multitasker is written in either you can run the daemon in either C or Java, and then they have APIs for all the other languages. So if you're using PHP, you have a PHP script, you run the Gearman daemon, and then you can just send the PHP jobs to Gearman. Say run this script and then run that script and so forth. So I guess what I'm getting at is that so one way of interoperability in this case is to simply use use the languages that are best suited for the job, and then create APIs for everybody else. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense to me.
Oh, you did? Okay.
Yeah, I think that matches with the Unix philosophy. You guys were mentioning if you're running on Unix, right? And really, Unix has had all of these wonderful process control things forever that really let you link together applications. Like I imagine that you'd call Gearman with a system call, right? It's just a command line call, and then your PHP script can return to the user, right? And then Gearman runs your program when it reaches it in the queue, right? Is that was the idea of it? Is that how Gearman was called?
I haven't studied it
Oh,
that
okay.
much yet. I was kind of looking at the basic framework. There's a pair library
Oh, cool.
in PHP,
Right,
so
right.
you can run your Gearman client in PHP using the pair library, and there's also a Gearman extension for PHP, so you can actually have a compiled extension to PHP, which obviously would be the highest performance one. So I think those were the two ways in, basically. And so if you had a compiled extension, then it would be a PHP, a native PHP command would show up, right? If you have the extension loaded, and the pair library are just I guess I don't know if they're opening sockets to it. I guess they're
Yeah,
opening
that's my
sockets.
guess.
That would make sense,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, so I think that's a really good example of, I don't know, we can make a fine distinction between different levels of open source in the language world, like things like PHP and Python and Perl. They're totally community maintained, they're community focused. Whereas sure, there's GCC and there's Microsoft C and all these different compilers for C, but when someone makes a contribution to PHP, that's available to everyone. If someone makes a contribution to C, well, that has to go through ANSI, right? And ANSI's not really an open source thing.
Well, I think it also speaks to the power of open source communities in that because open source is most often based off of some level of volunteerism, the features that get built are going to be the ones that people need. There's not going to be any kind of guessing, because if you're guessing, you're basically, and nobody wants to use that individual feature, you're basically wasting your time. And it's time that people are donating. And so what I think that what you see with a lot of open source programming languages and open source operating systems, open source software, is that you have software that's designed very much around a need. There's something that needs to get done, and so somebody just takes it upon themselves to build it. Whereas I think sometimes in the commercial world, you'll have more of a top-down, people kind of looking at a market, and they'll say, okay, we need to have this, and this feature, but there might be something else that, customer A down here, who's just a small customer, needed, but they can't access it because it hasn't been designed in. Whereas with the open source paradigm, what you have is, if that company A needs a certain feature, they can build it. And if they're feeling diagnosed, they can take that feature and they can contribute back. So what you find out in a lot of open source programming languages, at least this is my finding and it's my opinion, but my finding as well, that you don't have a lot of wasted space for superfluous features. It's very much based upon what is the need of that individual community, which I personally, I really do appreciate that.
Yeah, I like having the kitchen sink available.
Yeah.
Like, you install Pear and, well, you need to interface to Gearman, which I've never heard of, and it'll be there.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's with PHP is a really good example of that. Is that you have things like Pear, and then you have all the different frameworks out there: Zen framework, Symfony, Cake. All these individual, these frameworks and libraries that are built out there aren't built because somebody just wanted to waste an evening. They're built because people had problems that need to be solved. And so they solved those problems and then shared those problems with basically the rest of the world. So you have all these individual little frameworks, all these individual libraries that other people can use because these individual components were there to solve a problem.
Right on. How are we doing for time? Or do you have something more to say?
Well, I was going to mention that Kevin and I were also talking about frameworks this morning, which is another can of worms. So we were, I was talking about how, Ruby has, they have Rails and maybe a couple other frameworks, and Python has a few, but PHP has 20 frameworks. If you search around for PHP frameworks, there are probably 12 to 15 that are, maybe 10 that are pretty serious, and 15 that are sort of serious, and 5 more that are sort of serious, and another 5 that are just out there. And I think, I'm not sure. I guess that, it seems like a lot of these frameworks are mostly redundant when I look at them. Some of them have some performance differences, and some of them are designed more like Ruby and Rails, and some of them are uh, homebrew kind of things. They're all MVC style. But they basically all solve the same sort of problem in slightly different ways. And I think if the PHP community were focusing more energy on a few frameworks, maybe 5 frameworks instead of 20, it would just be much juicier. It would be much more useful for the community. That people would be spending much more time getting work done than they would be writing new libraries or fixing problems or things. So I don't know. I'm curious, Thomas. Why do you think there's so many frameworks?
This is a case of it's too easy. And it's actually that it's easier to make a new framework than to understand one that was made by someone else. Because there are probably no comments in that code. It's only understood by the person who made it. And the only one you're going to understand is the one that you wrote.
Well, some of them allegedly are just rip-offs of Ruby and Rails, or they try to follow that as closely as possible. So one would think that they would be, anyone that follows that style would be reasonably similar. But so you're saying it's a documentation problem?
Well, I think it's not so easy to pick up the Ruby on Rails paradigm, and and certainly I saw a quote from a Ruby guy saying essentially that, confessing that was a trade-off in Ruby on Rails, is that it really constricts what you can do, and you'll hit a brick wall of, oh, you just can't do that with Ruby on Rails.
Yeah.
And maybe that's what leads people to make other frameworks, is that someone has built a framework to make Drupal or Joomla or WordPress or something like that, and you hit a brick wall where it's like, yeah, you just can't do that in this without stripping it down and reworking it, and because it's so easy to make stuff like this in PHP, you just make a new one. And I've been using little PHP programs that I'll download, like there's a thing, MyTinyTodo, and I downloaded it, and yeah, it had a re-implementation of database abstraction classes, it had a re-implementation of some Ajax GUI and all this stuff, and I was thinking, okay, isn't there some pair class for this? Isn't there some thing that they could have used? But, and this is just an example, there were no comments in any of that code. So it took really a long time for me to add any features to it because I had to basically execute the code in my head to do that.
I tend to agree with that. I think you have to be, when investing in a framework, you have to think a bit towards the future. What are all the boundaries with which you want to build your application? What is the furthest you want your application to go? You should think that far, because most of these frameworks, you can get 80 or 70% of the job done really quickly, right? And it's optimized for that. And maybe even if there's good documentation, it's optimized for that. But the moment you come to that 20%, right, that you need to do something a little bit different from the framework, then you need to do some very heavy programming to first completely understand how that framework was built, understand code for probably which there's no documentation. And then it becomes much harder than if you were to build a whole framework from scratch anyway. So I think before investing in framework, you must always think, where do I want to go? What is the furthest I want to take my application? If it's just simple CRUD functionality, fine. Most frameworks can do that. But if you want to go and do something really innovative and really fantastic, maybe you should not. Maybe you should think of building something from scratch and building it from ground up to cater to that need.
I was talking with one of our pre-sales consultants once, and he made an interesting statement. He said that you shouldn't be using a framework until you know you need to use a framework, which I think is it's very apt, because one of the things I've run into with several people is they'll take they're new to PHP and they say, okay, we're in PHP now. What framework do we use? Like, well, do you know why you need to use a framework? Well, no, but everybody else is using frameworks, so we're going to use a framework too. Well, that's kind of a little bit backwards. How can you know what you want to use and why you want to use it in a framework without knowing why it is that you want to use it? And so I think that when you're looking at things like frameworks, first of all, deciding first, does your application even need a framework? Or does it just need some components? Like, for example, if you're building an application that's going to be connecting to Flex and Flash on a browser or using the Air runtime, that doesn't necessarily mean you have to build your entire application on Zen Framework. But Zen Framework has an AMF implementation that Adobe has been working with, and they've deployed with their own Flash builder as well. So then you can use it as kind of a library. Same thing with Paired. Maybe there's something in Paired that you can use so you don't have to write your own code. And I know that when I started out in programming, I was a little bit guilty of this as well. What I would do is I had a problem to define, and I was going to fix that problem from point 1 to point 250. I really wanted to solve the entire problem, which was probably good from an educational standpoint. But the older I get, the more I enjoy being a lazy programmer and working off of other people's work. And so now when I need to do something, I'll look at Zen Framework, I'll look at Symfony, I'll look at Pear or Peckle or whatever it is out there, and try and find something that somebody else has done because I really want to be a lazy programmer. So I think the best programmer is a lazy programmer who doesn't overthink and overanalyze the problem. Who analyze it. There's the quote from Einstein: make something as simple as possible, but not too much. Is that the quote?
No simpler.
But no simpler. And I think that developers like to make very complex problems because they like making very complex problems. And sometimes really it's just find somebody else who's done it, or find a framework that kind of fits in with what you want to do. And it's not really that hard of a thing to do. Like, there is 20 or 50 or 100 individual PHP frameworks out there. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you need to be using them or evaluating each of them. There's lots of information out there on which ones are better. In documentation with Zen Framework, we have thousands of pages of documentation on our site to go through. And I know that with Symfony and Cake and all these other people, they have documentation. You can take a look at it. You can usually find out pretty quickly whether or not a framework's going to do what you want to do.
Yeah.
And it really depends on what type of an architecture. Do you want to build your application around a specific framework, or are you looking for components that you can plug in and be a lazy programmer with?
I think also using a framework is also about a little bit about trust. Right? I've seen a lot of these frameworks, and in terms of the website, they put up some fantastic things: most secure, and most stable, most reliable. But when you actually start using them, they're not so stable or reliable as you hope they would be. So it's also about trust. Do you trust someone else to handle your security for you? Do you trust them to handle, the session management, the creation of the page? So I think you first have to build that trust before you're able to do that framework. Or do you trust yourself to handle that security and build it yourself? So you need to weigh those pros and cons. And I do understand the other side of the view of using frameworks, which is that a lot of that reuse and that functionality is built into it, so you don't have to worry about it. But you still have to make sure that you trust that that whoever built it has fully implemented it properly. So I think that's the thing there. And I think any project really needs a lot of rigor, whether it's by you or by whoever third-party libraries you depend on. I think that's just part of being a professional software engineer. You have to do due diligence in terms of your code reviews and doing your testing and things like that. So it just depends on where it happens.
While you were talking about that, something came up in my mind about the trust. It's one level of trust to use a foundation as a framework, a framework as a foundation, but also then there's the programming language, and PHP 6 is out, right?
Nope.
No, not yet.
Nope.
Oh, okay. Last time I checked, it looked like it was almost ready.
Somebody released a book about it already, and that was kind of a big joke about it because PHP 6 is, from what I've seen, is nowhere. I mean, they're talking about PHP 5.4 now, which would be implementing a lot of the stuff that people have been talking about for PHP 6. But PHP 6 will probably end up being the route of Perl 6, which would be a 15-year work in progress.
Yeah, well, Perl 6 is coming at Christmas.
That's all right.
Well, but we didn't say which Christmas.
That's true.
Oh, so, right, the reason I brought that up is that I know PHP is still evolving as a language. Like PHP 5 brought object-oriented, like proper classes, I think.
Yeah, proper classes. There was object-oriented programming in PHP 4, but it wasn't a proper OOP.
Right, and I'm trying to think of other things. Oh, closures?
Those in 5.3 already?
Yeah, that's in PHP 5.
I think those are in already.
What's that?
I think there's closures, I think, might be in already. I haven't used them
Yeah. Well,
in 5.3.
they're kind of closures, right? You have to say which variables you want inside the closure,
Oh, okay.
right? Right. So I wanted to talk about how backwards compatibility is very important in open source languages.
Right.
Versus, say, Microsoft, which is an upgrade mill, right? They want to force you to buy the new version. It really seems like you can take a PHP 4 app and it'll mostly work on PHP 5. If you did something weird in PHP 4, you might have to do it differently in PHP 5. Any comments on that?
Yeah, that's correct. If you actually look at the changelog, the backwards incompatibility page on PHP.NET between PHP 4 and PHP 5, I think if you were to print it out, it might be 2 pages, and most of those items are usually unused or rarely used functionality. So the PHP community has taken backwards incompatibility very seriously. I actually just ran into a customer last year who was running, for some reason, PHP 3 code, but they're running it on a PHP 5 interpreter.
Oh, that's great.
So
Yeah.
this was code that was written in 1998 and still running on PHP runtime with no changes.
Nice. Yeah.
They should have made some changes,
Oh,
but
well,
but it was still running. Nevertheless, it was still running on the most modern interpreter that you could get.
Right. So, and PHP 4 is EOL'd, right?
Yeah, it was EOL'd August 8th of 2008.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that is maybe some place where the open source community lacks a bit, and that is backward compatibility, because you have this whole group of volunteers, and they're motivated by doing the latest and greatest things, right? And they're not motivated by maintaining old versions of the software. So unfortunately, I mean, that does result in issues when people do upgrade. I mean, we did have issue in our project when we upgraded to the latest version of PHP. A lot of things broke. So certainly, I think that's something that we can, as open source community, can do better. But maybe that's also an opportunity for a business as well. Because if you look at the proprietary world, they do that to a reasonably good extent. They do have SLAs on the earlier versions of software, and then they commit to a closure and to auto migration path to the new version. But that is not something I see so often in the open source world, and that I think needs to be addressed.
Okay, well, in the best practices panel later today, I'm going to bring this up. And my suggestion is to compensate for this problem, where you have a dynamic foundation, you'll have a new kernel, a new Linux distribution, a new version of Apache, a new version of PHP. It's that at least once a week, you should upgrade everything to the bleeding edge version. And sure, that'll break something in your in-development application, but you'll fix that, and the way you fix it can make your application more robust against foundational changes, because you don't want to end up in a situation where you're running a PHP 3 app just because, great, it still works, but yeah, the code should have been upgraded.
Yeah,
I really like the idea of keeping everything fresh so that you don't end up with a bunch of systems where you just can't upgrade the kernel, or you can't upgrade Perl, or you can't upgrade, you can't upgrade your foundation because that will catastrophically break your application. And the only way to keep on top of that is to build your application in a dynamic environment where things are always breaking and you're always fixing them, because that's the reality of a production environment. And maybe that sounds crazy until there's a security hole in a piece of your foundation and you're forced to upgrade it, but your application is not robust against upgrades and you're scrambling to fix it.
Yeah, I think, the problem is that not all organizations can invest in those kind of people to maintain their applications. Some just have administrators maintain their applications, and they don't really know how to do all that most of the time. So
Oh, that's
that's
a
the
good point.
limitations that in reality that you have.
Oh, reality.
Maybe we should
Are
ask
we out
some
of time?
questions.
Oh, QA time? Okay, it's time for QA. Q&A.
Okay, sure.
Okay, anyone got some questions for us?
Okay, I would like to start with a little defense of what you have started. So PHP considered harmful. Coming from the PHP background myself, any language, you take Java or Python, I could still write a worst code and kill it, right? And I think the community bringing up with various frameworks, I have quite a hands-on experience working with Zen, Cake, and extensively in Drupal. I think these frameworks deliberately encourage or make the practice of engineering. There is a practice of engineering or anything that comes into development. Most PHP or LAMP developers gathered here think that writing a hello world PHP doesn't mean that you write. We are talking about enterprise applications, writing about enterprise class application. You have to go through that architecture. You need to do the architecture designing. Find out which is the best suited framework or components we have used. For example, few of the, as Kevin was mentioning, we have used in Cake PHP, taken a Zen library and used it over there. Interoperably, we have completely used Zen framework for few of the customers. You should choose appropriate. I don't think we can kill any language by writing. I could kill even a Java language by writing a memory leak. Anyone in the world like say there won't be, if you take this language, there won't be any bug at all. There's no such thing, I believe, right? Do you agree on that?
It's true. Let me. My major gripe about PHP versus all of the other P languages, all the scripting languages, is the lack of lexical scoping control on variables, where you have to declare it and it disappears after the block that it's in. And most of the just fundamental, like just stupid PHP errors that I've seen have been things like that, where someone has reused a variable somewhere else and, well, it wasn't isolated by its scope. And all of the errors I make in PHP programs are because I'm used to having the compiler say, yeah, this variable doesn't exist, or something like that. So that's just one thing, right? And I understand why PHP doesn't have that, because it didn't have it when it started out, and it's maintaining backwards compatibility. So, like, I really admire PHP enterprise developers because they have to spend more time thinking to make their programs correct.
I think yes, that's a large amount of time of us is going into that really. That's the case. And I think other languages we have also taken into like RO or Ruby on Rails and Python, which also eventually is accepted by the customer only if we endorse a framework. That is the true statement in the industry, as far as I know. It doesn't have been accepted just like that from the customer. If you go and say we will develop in Python, the next question, what framework? What's the architecture? So that I think from the industry standpoint we need to understand, rather competing on the languages, who's the best. I agree with like we should use the best, the blend of the best of all of it.
Sure, and I think it's sad that a web application framework is somehow intrinsically monolingual. We need a web application framework that lets you implement different functions in different languages and call them, and maintain your database connection between those calls and your environment between those calls. I think that would really improve the state of web application development, so that we could have a system in which every function is implemented in 3 languages, and you can run a regression test against that. And yeah, I know in reality we don't have those resources.
I was just going to say,
I'd like to second your comment actually. I think this is very much a profession. It's a we are professionals in this domain. I mean, it's very easy to write bad applications, but that's why we had to learn so much and be trained so much to get that far and to write rigorous enterprise applications. I think it's not the language. I think you should pick the language based on its focus, in my personal opinion. Based on you as a professional has a whole bunch of tools available to you, and there are different languages and different frameworks. You're a professional, you need to make the right choices so that you deliver that rigor and value and security and whatever to your clients. So I think that there's more on us, and that's why people pay us to build applications. Otherwise people would not be paying us if we just
Well, it seems to me that the majority of PHP programmers came to programming through PHP, and they learned programming without that rigor. So they have to work more to acquire it.
that's, I think that there's some truth in that statement, though I don't think that that's true in all cases. There's a lot of PHP developers who are actually coming from the enterprise. I think Siddhartha had a slide up. They're looking at 2014, we're going to have about 2.5 million PHP developers inside of the enterprise. And I've talked with Java developers who are moving from Java to PHP just because they want to get their stuff done quicker. And so I think that there's truth in that, and that a lot of the stuff that people think of when they're thinking about PHP is stuff that was written by the kind of programmer that I was 6 years ago. I look back on that code right now and I just want to dry heave. It's awful, awful code. But I think that the PHP community has really moved forward in terms of expressing coding standards and implementing best practices that has improved the quality of PHP code tremendously. There's a lot of things that PHP will allow you to do. That doesn't mean that you should be doing them. I find that even for myself, even just turning on a certain level of logging in PHP, so you have eNotice turned on, so that you don't have, or so that you're checking whether or not a variable has been instantiated or not. PHP will still run. It'll still do it, but it'll give you a notice saying that, hey, you're using a variable that hasn't been instantiated. Please properly instantiate this variable.
Okay. Put that in the best practices list.
It is. Good. It's in our best practices.
so this,
But yeah, and I think that you had a thought, but I forgot. It was actually, let me go on top of something you said, but I forgot. But yeah, I mean, in terms of PHP code, PHP started because you get it done really quick web application, and we made mistakes in terms of our implementation. But possibly because of those, PHP was able to really come up in terms of its market share. The PHP community now has almost the about face. We've got developers, from GE, Disney, Fox. You saw the slide that Siddhartha had up earlier on. There's a lot of big companies with people who have a lot of money on the line, that if that PHP application is not running correctly, that they stand to lose a lot of money. Mm-hmm. And when people stand to lose a lot of money, they tend to be a little bit more careful. So it's definitely very possible to build well-architected PHP applications that rival those of Java or .NET or something like that. Completely different focus, but you have the ability to have a well-architected solution that doesn't have a lot of those issues. And simply by turning on eNotice, running proper unit tests on your code, all that kind of stuff, you can often see a lot of that stuff where you're kind of used to the compiler telling you, but just by simply implementing some best practices like unit testing or using continuous integration or something of that nature, the likelihood of those issues actually showing up is drastically reduced.
I was just going to comment that it looks like it did turn out as a PHP versus the other languages debate in the end, didn't it?
Yeah.
So I'll kind of echo Kevin a little bit there. I think that so the problems in the enterprise are going to be problems with developers or quality of code in the enterprise are going to be management issues, and standardization of best practices. I mean, you need to have, people using source code control systems and unit testing and, Scrum or whatever methodology works best. And there needs to be enforcement and review, and it doesn't matter what language you use. You can make craptastic code in any language. What I've seen in enterprise development shops is just that you have to have management that knows what they're doing, and that's the primary issue. So.
Okay, we have to close this session. So thanks very much to all the panelists. I think it's been an interesting discussion. I hope the audience enjoyed it as much as I did, because I sure did. Thanks very much.